Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We had over 800 people register for this event, and it looks like we have some 360 some and climbing right now, and that's just great. I want to give a very special thanks to the 79 organizations who co-sponsored the event and helped us get the word out about this important discussion. My name is Denise Duffield. I'm the Associate Director of Physicians for Social Responsibility Los Angeles, and I serve on the steering committee of Back from the Brink, bringing communities together to abolish nuclear weapons. Our program today features a conversation with Annie Jacobsen, investigative journalist and author of the New York Times bestseller, Nuclear War, A Scenario. Later in the program, Annie will be joined by Archbishop John C of Santa Fe, Eddie Laiche, and Dr. Ira Helfand for a panel discussion. After the discussion, we'll have time for some Q&A using the Q&A feature on the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can submit your questions at any time. This event has been organized by Back from the Brink, a coalition of organizations, individuals, and elected officials working on a multi-year grassroots campaign calling for the U.S. to lead negotiations for a multilateral, verifiable, time-bound agreement among nuclear weapon states to eliminate their nuclear arsenals, and to secure a set of common sense policy solutions that can help prevent nuclear war. You can learn more about us at preventnuclearwar.org. 27 UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons as a vehicle to build public demand and political will for nuclear abolition in the United States. Back from the Brink works to change U.S. nuclear weapons policy by organizing locally in communities to build an active, diverse, visible constituency for nuclear disarmament that is powerful enough to change the nuclear status quo in this country. The campaign was designed so that anyone can get involved and make a meaningful difference. And it is that sense of agency that makes it possible for us to have a difficult conversation like the one we're about to have. We simply don't have to accept nuclear Armageddon as a fate over which we have no say. As of right now, we do still have a democracy. We vote for individuals to represent us, and we must demand they take action on this issue and organize our communities to do so as well. The threat of nuclear war is real, and it is rising. While the primary response from Washington decision makers seems to be to spend more and more on lethal weapons while doubling down on faulty Cold War era policies and nuclear deterrence theory that will not keep us safe. There remains only one arms control treaty between the U.S. and Russia limiting the size of their nuclear arsenals, the New START Treaty, which expires in 2026. Meanwhile, the U.S. and other nuclear armed states are increasingly engaged in a dangerous and costly new arms race. And nuclear saber rattling continues with the threatened use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine and Gaza, deadly wars that could well become larger conflicts. Amidst all of this, in March, investigative journalist Annie Jacobsen published her latest book, Nuclear War, A Scenario. And it is about just that, a scenario, one of many, but a scenario that is based upon dozens and dozens of interviews with high-level military and government officials who detail U.S. nuclear warfighting and response plans. If you haven't read it yet, please do, no matter how much you already know, how many books or movies or lectures you may have seen on the topic. Jacobsen's account of nuclear war, told in present-day times and peppered with history lessons, is a gripping minute-by-minute account of a hypothetical but highly plausible nuclear war that would end life as we know it in a little over an hour. It forces the reader to visualize exactly what will happen after a nuclear attack, what the U.S. will do and why, what other nuclear weapon states are likely to do, the defense and communication systems that will fail, and the nearly unimaginable devastation that ensues. Nuclear War, A Scenario makes abundantly and painfully clear what most of us here already know. A nuclear war is not winnable or survivable. The book illustrates a horrific reality of what we face if we don't rid the world of these unjust and immoral weapons. In March, the New York Times published a series called At the Brink, which stated, nuclear war is often called unimaginable. In fact, it's not imagined enough. So perhaps we can and should talk plainly about the reality of nuclear war. But if so, we must pair that with that difficult information with the good news that there are many meaningful actions we can take to prevent this frightful scenario from happening. And we've structured this conversation to provide that balance. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Annie Jacobsen. Annie, if you could please turn on your camera. All right. Annie Jacobsen is a Pulitzer Prize finalist and a New York Times bestselling author. Her books include Area 51, Operation Paperclip, The Pentagon's Brain, Phenomenal, Surprise, Kill Vanish, and First Platoon. Jacobsen's books have been named Best of the Year and Most Anticipated by outlets including The Washington Post, USA Today, The Boston Globe, Vanity Fair, Apple, and Amazon. She has appeared on countless TV programs and media platforms discussing war, weapons, government secrecy, and national security. She also writes and produces TV, including Tom Clancy's Jack Ryan. Jacobsen graduated from Princeton University, where she was the captain of the women's varsity ice hockey team, and she lives in Los Angeles with her husband, Kevin, and their 2 sons. Please welcome Annie Jacobsen. So, Annie, to start the conversation, for decades, we've been told that if we talk about the horrors of nuclear war, people will become paralyzed, will be written off as alarmist. Yet if we don't provide this information, if we don't talk about vaporized cities with no infrastructure or communications, about gruesome deaths from blast injuries and radiation, about nuclear winter and the end of humanity, well, then the problem doesn't seem very urgent, especially when there's so many other problems we're facing. So I was wondering how it is that you think about this paradox. In the book's acknowledgments, you quote UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres' 2022 pronouncement that humanity is just one misunderstanding, one miscalculation away from nuclear annihilation, and that we must reverse course. You then write, how true. The fundamental idea behind this book is to demonstrate in appalling detail just how horrifying a nuclear war would be. Is it fair to deduce that in part you wrote the books in the hopes that it would make a difference, that it would lead to change? Oh, gotta unmute.
Thank you for that introduction, and what an interesting, broad topic we're here to talk about, and yet it's so specific. It is nuclear war. And yes, I absolutely wrote the book in horrific detail to perhaps demonstrate to people that it doesn't have to be that way. I am not a fatalist, I am an optimist. But I did write the book because in my previous 6 books, all of which dealt with military and intelligence community people at the highest levels of government, I was really sort of taking a lot of mental notes at how many of these individuals working on these Cold War military and intelligence programs for decades would say to me with kind of a swelling pride in their chest that what they did was to prevent nuclear World War III. And in the last administration's, former President Trump's rhetoric about fire and fury and kind of threatening nuclear war with North Korea, I began to really wonder what happens if deterrence fails. And I took precisely that question to my sources. And the result is the book.
An alternate title for this book could have been called When Deterrence Fails. Deterrence, the false doctrine that possessing nuclear weapons prevents their use and somehow keeps us safe. It's just been sold to the public and Congress for so long, it largely seems unquestioned. I would assume the majority of the folks you interviewed believe in deterrence, but you also say that everyone you talk to knows nuclear weapons are insane. So I'm wondering, do you think on some level these officials do know then that deterrence is a myth, or did you get any sense of how they reconcile that understanding? Is it possible to believe in deterrence yet also know nuclear weapons are insane?
These are the kind of questions you're asking me that I asked my sources. And what was remarkable was working on this book when most of the reporting I was doing was happening. It was during COVID. And it's astonishing to just go back a few years in time and realize this issue that we now have front and center in the news, with world leaders actually threatening the use of WMD. I mean, the president of Russia has said repeatedly he's not joking about the use of that. North Korea is accusing the United States of having a sinister intention to provoke nuclear war. And yet, just a few years ago, when I was interviewing these Cold War warriors, that was not in the zeitgeist. And one of the sort of, I think, reasons for talking to me was the sense that the threat of nuclear war had disappeared from everyone's minds, from everyone's realities. And so to have the book publish in the middle of this new perception of the world that we are in is really shocking. And I think it's shocking to my sources
So,
because usually people, well, let me put it this way. I've had behind the scenes conversations with a number of sources that are in the book who share with me an escalating concern inside of themselves. And sometimes when you're a journalist and you publish a book, you might get a little bit of an opposite reaction from sources sometimes, which is like, right? I mean, because they read the book in whole and then they have a moment to reflect. But with this book, it has been embraced to a degree that is both alarming and also inspiring, optimistic, if we shall say.
yeah, so it's current events then that maybe have chipped away at the sense they might have had that deterrence was the way, that now there's that's the sense was that it's current events that sort of made them start to realize that the folly of these weapons, or that maybe
Yeah,
deterrence in the Cold War era is not the same in right now.
of course, yes. So let me speak to that very important question you asked, because you're asking about deterrence and do the sort of officers that dedicated their lives to deterrence, in air quotes, do they feel the same way that they did when they were in a position to essentially play that role if it came down to it? And what really struck me was this idea, first and foremost, of how I had to unpack what deterrence actually is to most of the general people in the American public. This group is probably a lot more educated on these issues than most people. But the average Joe or Jane walking down the street didn't realize that we even had such a policy as deterrence, that if we have a big arsenal of nuclear weapons pointed at your arsenal of nuclear weapons, then we'll all be safer. And I think a reason a lot of the people didn't know that is because it reckons back to this decades old idea. When deterrence was born, it was on the heels of this insane concept that nuclear war could be fought and won. And that is astonishing. And so the policy is kind of, carried over as a relic from this absurd idea. And many of the people that you're asking about had to kind of move along with that twisting and turning policy I'm talking about in the 60s, 70s, and 80s to where we are now, without ever taking a pause and saying, what does deterrence really mean in 2024? The world is entirely different.
Yes. And I was struck by the many acknowledgments by decision makers of core problems in U.S. nuclear weapons policy. You wrote that both President Bush and President Obama expressed concerns about launch on warning policies, but didn't do anything about it. We know President Biden, as a candidate, expressed support for a no first use policy, but the U.S. just turned down a Chinese proposal to negotiate on no first use policies. Why do you think it is that leaders who acknowledge critical problems with U.S. nuclear weapons policies don't then do more to change them?
I think you've hit upon the $1 million question here, because of all the media that I have done and all the questions that have come at me, I have been able to answer all of them, essentially, except for that one, because I don't have that answer. The only person, or rather people, that have the answer to why isn't something done by the President of the United States when we have seen presidential candidates saying they would do something, and whether we're talking about launch on warning policy or no first use, pretty much just launch on warning policy specifically, and yet they don't do it. Why? So, I'll jump right ahead here just a little to give a little action point, perhaps to the audience, because I loved that you said in the intro that we're, we're all here to realize that not just talk about the horrors of nuclear war, but this idea that action could be taken. And perhaps if people want to keep an eye out for me on Twitter, I'm Annie Jacobsen on Twitter, I will pose perhaps some of those questions to the presidents, the former presidents themselves. And maybe people here can retweet them. It seems like such a simple thing, but in the world in which we live in 2024, it feels to me more than ever that the people's voice can be amplified and heard.
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, part of the current buildup we have right now may have less to do with what defense officials or administrative officials believe is necessary for 21st century national security than with agencies like the Department of Energy and its semi-autonomous National Nuclear Security Administration that are staffed with unelected career weaponeers, or the role of defense contractors like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and their lobbyists. Did any of those influences come up at all in your interviews?
Absolutely. I mean, I have been writing on all those organizations in all of my books, and I'm very familiar with the concept of the military industrial complex, not as some kind of wild conspiracy, but rather as a deep rooted economic power in the United States. I mean, people think often of Eisenhower's speech, where that phrase came from, beware the military industrial complex. I'm paraphrasing him. But looping back to our earlier point, even more important, I believe, is the latter part of Eisenhower's speech. He also offered an antidote to the military industrial complex. He said an alert and knowledgeable citizenry was the antidote to that military might. And so that's why I write books, in essence, is to give the information to the people. I do not write politically. I just write about POTUS, the office of the president. I think, to your point, that it is indeed the organizations, the defense contractors, the sort of career individuals who are part of the system that continue the system. It's been called the self-licking ice cream cone to me by people at the Pentagon. So that becomes part of it. But again, it's and I work with these people. I have some of sources for years, some of them for 15 years. And in and of themselves, they're not like twirling mustache bad guys like we have in Hollywood. They are individuals who have a career. And so part of what I find powerful as a journalist is I interview retired careerists. And hopefully I'm able to bring to people, readers, more so in this book perhaps than any, that, wow, sometimes people leave positions of power and they have doubts. And that is an important concept, the concept of doubt, because I believe it helps individuals that are currently working in that system to perhaps have one more degree of checking their own intentions.
And of the folks that you've talked to, folks that have read the book in the government and military sphere, and through interviews you've had since the book has been published, have you had any reactions that would indicate hearts or minds are changing, or that there's a little desire to take action, to use even their former status, to use the weight of their position to, as a result of having read the book?
So that's like a two-parted question, which is very important. So when the book initially published, I mean, I was receiving emails from around the country from, oh, here we are, 3 admirals at the Space Force Convention in Colorado. Love your book. All kinds of military folks. So on the one hand, that, and on the other hand, the former guitar player for the Red Hot Chili Peppers. I mean, those 2 emails came in one day to kind of indicate the kind of reaction I was getting from all walks of life, all kinds of careers, people saying, this is insanity, it must change. So the first part of your question is there seems to be a universal agreement that nuclear war is insane and is also, as Guterres said, closer than we think. But on the other hand, the buck kind of stops there, meaning it is only in the follow-on work that I've done with you, with ICANN, with that I begin to realize, oh, lots of talking about this is madness, but very little next step, very little follow through. And I don't know why that is, but I know from an earlier conversation that we all had, those of us on this Zoom here, that that has to do with the groundwork being laid over decades, as done by this organization and others, gets to continue and gets to perhaps ratchet up at a moment in time like this. And if my book is a catalyst for that, that's a win-win.
It sure is. It sure is. And you wrote also about how little presidents know and about the reality of nuclear war. And we certainly know that's true for Congress members as well. But you write about President Reagan's reaction after watching the 1983 TV movie The Day After, which was also so vividly portrayed the horror of nuclear war and leading to, the so-called Reagan reversal. Do you think it's possible this book or a film based upon it could have the same impact?
I do think it's possible because what could be more powerful than the story that you're referring to, which is known to people in Washington as the Reagan reversal? And for people on this webinar who aren't familiar with it, I'll just give the brief version of it. It's that in 1983, there was an ABC TV film called The Day After, and it showed a fictional nuclear war between the United States and then Soviet Russia. And it was terrifying. 100 million people watched it, including President Reagan. Interestingly, his White House advisors did not want him to watch it, but he had a screening of it at Camp David. And in his now declassified White House journal, he wrote that he became greatly depressed. And that depression from the president led to reaching out to Gorbachev, to seeing the leader of Russia, of the Soviet Union at the time, not as the enemy, but as an adversary, as an opponent. And it led to the Reykjavik summit. And as a result, the world has gone from the all-time high of 70,000 nuclear warheads, 70,000, to the approximate 12,500 we have today. And to add a little anecdote to that, in terms of the people who have been communicating with me, of all people that I had a 30-minute conversation with, Newt Gingrich, who, in my days was associated, I can see these pictures of him with Reagan in the White House. And Speaker Gingrich said to me that he read my book and he was horrified. And he suggested that I write another book called Nuclear War, a Solution. And I told him that was the job of the people.
Well, yes, that's, and it should be a unifying issue. This affects all of us. And I think, the concerns at times we're lived in is that it's a little harder to make that case because of the polarization. But I think if you've got, Gingrich also saying it scares him, that just shows, this issue is not a partisan issue. This is an issue everybody needs to pay attention to.
And
And
maybe that's sort of the best example. We're not going to put words in Speaker Gingrich's mouth, but your question about deterrence, which is so significant, I think, to this conversation, which is, does deterrence make sense? Or said differently, how could deterrence make sense in the world in which we live today? How can that make sense anymore? What other realities are we dragging along from the 1950s? Very few. That was a time of radio and black and white TV.
yeah, and even then, it's not necessarily deterrence that kept us safe. We had lots of near misses and accidents and miscommunication. So it's hard to disprove a negative with deterrence. But we can't let our security be based off of luck, which is pretty much where we are now, unless of course we do have the Mad King scenario that you write about. I thought your book ended with the most powerful passage when you said, with time after a nuclear war, all present day knowledge will be gone, including the knowledge that the enemy was not North Korea, Russia, America, China, Iran, or anyone else vilified as a nation or a group. It was the nuclear weapons that were the enemy of all of us all along. And I think that really gets right to the heart of the matter, because And back from the Brink's point of view, and I think most of the folks here, the only way we can truly prevent a nuclear war is to abolish nuclear weapons. So I think at this time, I'd like to bring on our panelists, the three leaders who have dedicated themselves to doing just that. So I'm going to ask you all to turn on your cameras and as I do the introductions. We'll begin with Archbishop John Wester of Santa Fe, New Mexico, who is a leading voice for nuclear abolition in the U.S. Catholic Church, who penned a groundbreaking pastoral letter called Living in the Light of Christ's Peace, a Conversation Towards Nuclear Disarmament. And he wrote that in 2022 after having visited Hiroshima and Nagasaki a few years prior. Eddie Laiche is a very recent graduate of John Burroughs High School in Burbank, California, where he founded the Burbank Nuclear Abolitionist Club. He is also a co-founder of Students for Nuclear Disarmament, which is a partner organization of Back from the Brink. And then we have Dr. Ira Helfand, who is one of the world's leading voices and advocates for nuclear disarmament, who helps lead the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, co-founded Physicians for Social Responsibility, and serves on the steering committee of Back from the Brink. Welcome, panelists. So first, I'm going to ask you all to share a few reactions to the book, and then we'll have some specific questions. But again, really all of you, Annie included, please feel free to jump in and talk to each other and respond to each other if you're so moved. And we'll begin with Archbishop Wester. How has this book impacted you, particularly given your role as the Archbishop of Santa Fe, home to Los Alamos Nuclear Laboratory, which to this day plays such a major role in the testing and development of nuclear weapons?
Yes, thank you very much, Denise, and thank you, Annie. I loved your book. I'm not sure if that's the right way to put it, but I did love your book. It was difficult to read, but it was a page turner, and I've lost a lot of sleep because of you. So, but I'd say for me as Archbishop of Santa Fe, yes, we're right next door to Los Alamos Labs and Sandia Laboratories. It really the book really brought home to me the reality and the horror of nuclear war. I think, and I'm with everybody else, I think we don't want to think of such things. We try to forget about it. But the book was so real, so well researched. It was so accurate. It was so precise, and it really laid out exactly the power of these weapons and what would happen if they were ever used. A few months ago, I read Cormac McCarthy's The Road, and you made reference, of course, to the day after. It reminded me, actually, Annie, your book reminded me very much of the book Failsafe when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s. And yours is much more real, but still, it brought that back, that it could happen. And I think that we live in we've lulled ourselves into a false sense of complacency. And I think this book, I hope, will shock us into realizing how dire the situation is that we're in right today.
Thank you for those kind words and your thoughts on that. I echo back.
Thank you, Annie. Yeah, appreciate it.
We'll move to Eddie. Tell us how you reacted to the book, and how do you think reading the book will impact your student organizing?
Thank you for the question. And quite frankly, this book was so terrifying for me. But what really, helped me continue to read it was like the almost top secret information that I was getting from it. It was newly declassified information, and just learning about exactly how our government is planning for this apocalypse, that once the outcome happens, nothing would matter afterwards. All of the money we're wasting towards planning for it. It really was just so shocking, really shocking. And I thought I knew, more than the average person, but this is really just almost, it was very shocking. And so, but with that new knowledge, it has really just like encouraged me to continue my efforts, and to also, I know that it's developing my ability to talk with like high-ranking government officials who actually handle nuclear policy. And so through reading about the actual reality of the situation, what would happen, and all of the information that is currently available to me, I can best use this knowledge to make a difference in my conversations with them, having a more educated conversation. And it's just the same way that I've been introduced into this issue. I heard Dr. Helfand's speech. He gave a description of what would happen in the face of a nuclear war. And that's the same thing that I got from this book. It's a renew of my determination of what made me want to start being a nuclear weapons abolitionist. So while this book is very terrifying, I'm very thankful for it. And I'm going to continue to read it in the future to remind myself of that.
Eddie, thanks for saying that. And it makes me think that Eisenhower should have added to his addendum to the nuclear, where he said, an alert and knowledgeable citizenry spearheaded by another generation like Eddie.
Oh, I'm sure that would have been funny, right, if you did that.
He would have been psychic and looking into the future, but we can joke because the matter is so serious. But good
Yes.
for you for your advocacy. And I love that. I'm so grateful that my book allowed you to have a little more of the sort of chutzpah, shall we say, to move forward. Because keep in mind, that's the case for all of us. It certainly is for me. I stand on the shoulders of a lot of people who have laid the groundwork for what I have been writing about.
Thank you.
That's a very good point, Annie. And I feel the same way. I'm relatively new to this entire movement, and I've just been so amazed at the number of people who have, like yourself and Eddie and so many. Of course, Dr. Helfand is one of our, heroes in this whole thing. It's like many people are really promoting this cause, and so I have a lot of optimism too that people will listen. Here in New Mexico, we have Nuke Watch. Jay Coggins is the executive director. And it has a profound impact, I think, on people here in our state. And it's so I just want to have a shout out to you and to all the wonderful people who promote this cause. And it's not an easy cause to promote. I kind of feel like a skunk at a lawn party sometimes, but nonetheless, we have to do it. So thank you all.
Yes.
It's a good way to get out of a conversation at a party. If somebody asks you what you do, you start talking about this, they'll find someone across the room they want to go talk to.
I felt that.
I just wanted to add real quickly, Annie, I've been talking about this for a long time and pretty familiar with much of this information. Your book scared me. And it's having that effect, I think, on everybody who reads it, which is really good, because that's exactly what people need to be at this moment in time. They need to be hopeful, but they need to be scared, because there's so many issues that we're dealing with in the world. If people aren't afraid of nuclear war, they're not going to focus on it. And I think your book has done an enormous service in reaching a huge audience. I'm terribly grateful to you for writing it and for all the work you're doing in your speaking and since then in getting the word out to people about just the huge danger that we're facing.
And Ira, I do have the next question for you, which will continue along these lines, which is, you have been advocating for nuclear abolition for decades out of a deep understanding of the horrific medical consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. So what is it that gives you hope that we can change the direction of nuclear policies?
I think there are two things. One is the history that Annie alluded to before, the Reagan reversal. In 1983, we were on the brink of nuclear war. The US put missiles in Europe that were specifically designed to enable us to, quotes, fight and win a nuclear war in Europe. Totally insane idea, but it was US policy at the time. Less than 2 years later, Reagan and Gorbachev sat down and said nuclear war can never be won, it must never be fought. That didn't happen in a vacuum. It was a complete reversal of the nuclear policy of both countries. And it came about because millions of people, inspired by things like the day after, by all the work that Physicians for Social Responsibility did back in those days, educating people about the danger, millions of people with that information demanded a change in policy. And we didn't get rid of nuclear weapons then, but we stopped the Cold War arms race. And I think, frankly, we saved the world. I think we would have had a nuclear war if it were not for that reversal and for the public demand for it that led to it. So we've done this once before. We've had a huge impact on nuclear policy. And all we're saying to ourselves is we need to do it again. And the other thing that inspires me is the fact that we are seeing, I think, a significant increased attention to this issue just in the last year or two. As terrific as Annie's book is, I think if it had been published 3 years ago, it wouldn't have gotten the kind of attention it's getting now. Something has changed. You mentioned before, Denise, the New York Times series, At the Brink, which the Times used to dismiss nuclear abolition as kind of a fantasy. Now they're doing a year-long series talking about how important it is to do that. The same week that it was published, former Secretary of Energy Moniz had an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times saying the nuclear weapons which his department had built needed to be abolished. And then there's the incredible attention deservedly so, that your book is getting, Annie. Something is changing. There is a new openness to understanding that we need to do something about this.
Ira, it's almost takes my breath away to hear you say, with all of the decades of experience that you have, you believe if what had gone on in 1983 around that kind of reversal hadn't happened, we would have had a nuclear war. I mean, that is a terrifying concept. And I would agree with you that we are now where we were around 1983. And when you consider what Denise was talking in her introduction about the New START expiring and some of these modernization programs that are really signaling around the world to adversaries that a new nuclear buildup is on the horizon, we are approaching that era again, and it is quite shocking.
Yeah, and I think obviously we can't know what would have happened in the 80s, but I think it's pretty clear when you look at how close we came, how many times, that we truly dodged a bullet then. And it really is in some ways miraculous that we are all still here today. And when people like William Perry, the former Secretary of Defense, say that it's even more dangerous now than it was back then, we need to listen to that carefully. And we need to be not overwhelmed with fear, but motivated to take action, because we know that it is possible if we can mobilize the citizenry, as Eisenhower asked us to do. If we can do that, it is possible to change nuclear policy. And this time, the goal has really got to be the complete elimination of these weapons, because anything short of that leaves open the possibility that they're going to be used.
I think, too, along those lines, what really struck me in your book, Annie, and what Dr. Helfand is saying, is that these nuclear weapons are tremendously powerful, so much more powerful than what we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. And the second point is that in your book, point out the way you, I think, very adroitly talked about things down to the seconds and minutes, that we don't have our leaders don't have a whole lot of time to decide the fate of humanity and of all civilization. That we have to make these humongous decisions in just a matter of seconds, really, minutes. It's all you have, and that should never be the case. We human beings were never, in my view, should never have these godlike qualities that we can destroy so much in so little time and have so little time to make an informed decision. And so I think that was another part of your book that was very gripping, to have that sense of how quickly you have to say, really, that's it.
Yeah, on this idea of the citizenry and educated, informed, active citizenry, I want to talk to you, Archbishop Wester. As you know, the Catholic Church and most of the major faith institutions do have strong positions concerning nuclear weapons and the need to abolish them. What advice do you have for us to better reach out and engage not just the leaders in the institutions, but more of the faithful, the tens of millions of people in the U.S. who self-identify as religious? What might folks participating in this discussion do to engage with their own houses of worship or with local faith leaders in their community?
Well, I think in terms of religions and faith communities, I think that any religion, any faith is based on relationships. It's obviously a relationship with God and relationship with each other. And so I think we have to realize the power that each individual has. I think all too often our parishioners, our brothers and sisters do not recognize the power that they have. And I think Annie and Dr. are referring to that with President Eisenhower, that your voice is powerful. And so don't ever minimize the power of your voice. And that grows and expands. And so talk to your pastors, talk to rabbis and imams and those who have leadership, and tell them how concerned you are, and let them, and then if you can gather small groups to kind of continue that conversation and speak as a group. Political leaders, I had a chance to speak to one of our congresswomen 2 days ago, and they listen to votes. I remember in the immigration matter talking to one of our elected leaders, Speaker of the House, and she said to me, thank you, Bishop, for what you're saying, but you don't have the votes, and politicians look at votes. So we've got to be sure that we educate and not just change minds, but change hearts. We have to get people to really believe that this is an important topic, which it is. In our church, we believe strongly in the sanctity of human life. I can't think of any other issue that is so impactful on all of human life and all of civilization than the nuclear weapons that the mess that we're in right now. So I think just let your voice. Pope Francis said a few years ago that even the possession of nuclear weapons is immoral. I'd like to see more of my Catholic brothers and sisters listen to what the Pope is saying and do something about that. No one mentions that. I mean, he said even having them is immoral. So what does that mean for my church, for a Catholic in the United States, that we have an immoral situation that the Pope himself has declared? So how do we react to that? Do we respond to that? At least we have to have a conversation about it, seems to me.
Definitely. Eddie, you're a co-founder of Students for Nuclear Disarmament, which is a pretty exciting initiative, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to share the vision you and others have for S&D, what your goals are, what you hope the organization will look like a year from now, and again, to the folks here, how can we help? Are there specific ways folks in this meeting can help?
Thank you so much for asking. And I just want to start off that I totally agree with what you were saying, Archbishop. That was so encouraging. And what you were saying about like people, having the ability to make an innate change, that is so encouraging and so true for everyone. And that's like one of the main things that I, as the co-founder of Students for Nuclear Disarmament, are trying to teach my fellow young people, whether that be like in my chapter at my school or in my communications with students nationwide. And so basically with this organization, we want to bring young people around America to realize that to realize that nuclear weapons like aren't good. Like that's simply what it is. I mean, so many people, young people and adults, there's either a lack of information, a lack of conversation, or just misinformation or misunderstanding about nuclear weapons policy, especially in relation around deterrence and how nuclear weapons keep us safe. And we want to, as an organization and as a grassroots movement, change the common perception of deterrence that nuclear weapons do not keep us safe. They threaten our safety by their very existence. And having that as a more common knowledge will allow more political action to take place. And we focus on young people, especially high school and college students, for two reasons. One, because young people, we're going to be the next generation who's shouldering these efforts, because it is, whether we like it or not, it's going to be a long-term journey towards a world free of nuclear weapons. And we need, that's why we're focusing on young people who are going to carry it on in the future. And also, since it's high school and college, these social environments are great places for students to form clubs, for them to support each other and talk with each other, have discussions, because it is a very terrifying issue, and we can, support each other and create dialogue that create value and help us motivate each other to take action towards this issue and realize that we can make a difference, like Archbishop was saying. And so my vision for S&D in the future, I'd like to have, and 1 year from now, my goal is to have at least one chapter in every state of the U.S. That is my goal.
Great.
Yes.
Great. And Annie, are you speaking with students? Have you had student talks yet or interviews? And
I have not. I mean, most of my interviews are at the level of, press, radio, and television. But with that said, there are an extraordinary amount of young people that watch that, particularly the podcast that I've been doing, which I have to say has been a little bit of a break from mainstream publishing, meaning myself as the mother of two now, high school, college age boys, and I have been made aware of how many young people like Eddie watch podcasts, listen to podcasts. And so that has been a major thread of mine. I think I've done 35 podcasts on this book. That reaches a lot of students.
Hmm.
great.
It sure does.
And Ira, I'm going to move to you now. A core focus of the Back from the Brink campaign has been getting these local and state resolutions passed. So we have over 75 municipal and county resolutions and 7 state legislative bodies in cities large and small: Baltimore, Los Angeles, Chicago, Boston, and likewise hundreds of local and state officials, mayors, state representatives, senators, city councilors, county commissioners have all endorsed the campaign. Why is it so important for local and state leaders to speak out? And what advice do you have for folks who might want to reach out to their own mayors, city councilors, and governors?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the question of where are the votes in many ways. This is just a very powerful way of demonstrating to the people who are ultimately going to be making the decisions in Washington that there is broad support across the country. And it's not just traditional peace activists who are calling for the elimination of nuclear weapons. It's all the communities that make up our country, the city and town governments, the labor unions, the faith communities, the environmental groups, the student groups. We need to talk when we can directly to leadership in this country and try to persuade them of the folly of what they're currently doing. But it's been our experience that they tend to listen to those arguments best when they're hearing them from a whole lot of people. It's not just the arguments that persuade them, but the numbers of people who are putting those arguments to them. And so this grassroots organizing is just really key. We're not going to get change in US policy just by being clever and winning debates with people. We've got to demonstrate to the leadership of this country that people are concerned. That's what happened in the 80s. We got Reagan to listen. We probably wouldn't have even had him watch the day after if there hadn't been 1 million people marching in Central Park the year before. So this is part of a process of bringing communities together. As Eddie pointed out, it's really difficult to do this as an individual. It's easier if you do it as part of a community. And Back from the Brink has tried to create a vehicle whereby people can reach out to the communities they belong to and bring them into this campaign. And one of the key audiences I think that we need to reach is young people. And I just, in response to the question you posed earlier about why I'm optimistic, one other thing which I should have mentioned then, key reason why I'm optimistic is the response we're getting from young people. You know, this movement has tended to be older people, a lot of people of my generation who lived through the Cold War. There's been a narrative that's formed that you can't talk to young people about the nuclear weapons issue. They're not interested in it. And I think the experience that we're seeing with you know, students like Eddie is that's not true at all. We haven't been talking to young people, but that doesn't mean we can't talk to young people. And it's not that they're not interested, it's that we haven't told them why they should be interested. And it sort of indicates, I think, a really key area of the outreach work, the educational work that we need to do. If we're going to build a movement in this country, this whole generation of young people never lived through the Cold War. So they don't have that reservoir of sort of psychological trauma that the rest of us carry with us from having lived through that period. We need to bring this information to them. But the good news is that when we do bring this information to them, they respond. And Eddie didn't tell you, but you know what he did at his school, he organized a club. And Eddie, tell the story. It's your story, and it's a great story.
Well, I couldn't have done it without you. He told me about Back from the Brink campaign and how you can get you can I told first off, sorry, I told him that I wanted to create a club, but I didn't know what we could do to make a difference. And he told me that we can pass Back from the Brink resolutions or proclamations in our local city governments, calling for the U.S. to take initiative in global nuclear weapons disarmament. And so that was very exciting for me. And just learning that I could do something was very inspiring. So I created the club. I got a bunch of people to join, and we had meetings every week. I learned a lot. I taught them the things that I knew, and we had discussions about what they thought. And we got a bunch of signatures in our school, and then we started meeting with our local city officials. We met with the mayor, and then in just 3 months after the club was formed, we got the city of Burbank in California, to present a proclamation in support for the abolition of nuclear weapons on behalf of our club, applauding our efforts and supporting nuclear weapons abolition. So that was a great achievement. And we're working towards getting Adam Schiff, our House representative, to co-sponsor HRS 77, which is the it's the federal resolution that Back from the Brink supports and embodies, so to speak. Yeah, and Ira, I'd also like to add, like, it's so important what you were saying, that it's hard to we don't talk to young people enough about this issue, and definitely I think it's because it is so hard to talk about this issue, whether you're an adult or a young person. It's just like, it's so existential, it's uncomfortable to know, but it's we have to know this. It threatens us every day. The life that we, in the environment that we live in, that we currently, whether enjoy or not, it would all be gone permanently in the face of nuclear war. And like, I hope you guys don't mind, I'd like to read just like a quote from Nuclear War Scenario that really hits me hard and kind of reminds me of what I just said. So how tragic and ironic it is that human beings develop slow and steady over hundreds of thousands of years, culminating in the creation of vast and complex civilization, only to get zeroed out in a war that takes less than a few hours from beginning to end. So that just really embodies the urgency of this current situation. And we really need, it's a need. It's not even a subjective, they're not interested, or it's not very interesting. It's almost like a responsibility if we want to keep our future. That's how I personally feel about this issue. And I'm sorry to keep babbling, guys, but I forgot to mention, if there are any young people, like high schoolers or college students, who are interested in being involved with Students for Nuclear Disarmament, please fill out this Google form that I'm going to be posting in the chat right now. You can just fill in your information and we'll contact you, telling you all that you can do, giving you all the information and how you can get involved. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's why I'm optimistic.
Thank you, Eddie. Would you like to see Santa Fe, Eddie? Have you been to Santa Fe?
I haven't.
I'll fly you out here.
I'd love to visit.
Wonderful. So I think now we're going to move to some audience questions. And the first one we have is from Tom, and I think this kind of goes out to everybody, but maybe I'll answer a little bit of it and kick it around, which is anybody reaching out to unite different organizations, religions, governments to unite together in educating the public, pressuring governments to stop development, testing, no first use, nuclear weapons free, etc.? And I can say, I will answer. The answer is yes. Back from the Brink is doing just that. And what is really amazing about Back from the Brink and the hubs and the local resolutions is they can be customized. Some of the resolutions call for Back from the Brink's policy points and a nuclear weapons free zone. Some call for diplomacy with Iran. Some call for divestment. So there are, and we want as many folks as possible to join us. At the end of the webinar, I'll put up a slide with various ways that folks can get involved in Back from the Brink. But is there anybody else that wants to, among our panelists, who wants to talk about those efforts in response to Tom's question?
Well, just anecdotally, not on that big a level, but as I say, just the day, and we've talked to some of our elected officials, especially about Resolution 77. But germane to what was been said by the panelists is that it was interesting that the Congresswoman I talked to said, I agree with you, and I agree with the elements of Resolution 77, but my constituents that I represent don't, and so I can't back it up. And so I think that goes to what's been said, that we need, therefore, to work with the constituents, and we need to, Jay Coggan of Nukewatch, New Mexico, tells, I think he says it's apocryphal, maybe apocryphal, but they were talking to FDR and trying to convince him of some action. And he said, I agree with you, now make me do it. Wow. And so I think our call is, our charge is to make our elected officials do it by finding out what makes them do things. And I think we're touching on that. I really believe strongly that having a young person like Eddie is very persuasive with our elected officials. They know that these young people are a voting age now, getting to be voting age. And when young people speak out on these issues, I think people listen. And so I think there's lots of ways for us to get our politicians and our leaders to make them to do it if we really come together and speak with one voice.
Thank you. Our next question is from David K. Ms. Jacobsen, your book begins with the riveting account of a foreign power, presumably Russia, bombing the Pentagon. How likely is it that a nuclear war, if it occurs, would begin in that way versus a U.S. first use of nuclear weapons? Would a U.S. no first use policy help reduce the risk of nuclear war?
So the first part of the question, my scenario that I chose begins with a strike on the Pentagon of a 1 megaton thermonuclear weapon by North Korea. And the reason I chose that scenario was a series of conversations I had with the man who designed the explosive element of the world's first thermonuclear bomb, Richard Garwin. And that's the photograph on the cover of the book. And Garwin, who advised all presidents since the 1950s on nuclear weapons, said to me what he worried most was a nuclear arsenal in the hands of a mad king, a narcissist with a nuclear weapon. And so I interpreted that to mean North Korea, but of course it could mean anyone that is a narcissist with a nuclear arsenal. And as the world moves toward more nuclear armed nations than less, that threat rises. And again, the scenario I pose is just a scenario, not the only scenario, which is underscored by the Secretary of the United Nations reminding all of us just recently that we, the world, are one misunderstanding or one miscalculation away from nuclear annihilation. Those are his words.
Thank you. Amy B. Has Barack Obama ever explained how he shifted from advocating abolishing nukes to signing off on a major rebuild and investment? And anybody, this is for anybody, but Annie, you're up.
I think, Denise, you and I talked about that, and that's a great question. Thank you. I mean, that is the great mystery that we all want to know. And I will, as I said, send out a few tweets on that, asking those individuals directly, including former President Obama, because I think the citizenry, we alert knowledgeable citizenry, do have a right to ask questions and get some answers. And as a journalist, I learn that that is not necessarily impossible. You just can't give up. And that is what I would encourage anyone on this webinar that is thinking about all this is, you, like Ira said, you stay optimistic and you don't give up.
David R., you said in your book that everyone you talked to said the policy of deterrence is insane. Will those experienced people speak out? Do you think that any of those experts who have been at the institutions that developed and implemented deterrence, like RAND or the Kennedy School or the Military and Defense Department, would speak out and say we cannot rely on deterrence? If it fails, we all die?
Great question, slight correction. I never said that they said deterrence is insane, because boy, is that a tricky thing to walk back from. But I think if you are a person who put their career into that, but rather nuclear war is insane, which becomes the paradox of the book. As Eddie so eloquently said, well, if they say deterrence makes us safer, and nuclear war is insane, that is the chicken and egg scenario, or the catch-22, or the Orwellian conundrum that allows, I believe, for people to touch upon this issue, think about it, and then say, okay, well, take a big sigh and say, deterrence will hold because the Defense Department says it will. But the rub here, to answer your second part of your question, is this line that I found. So STRATCOM, the Defense Department, Nuclear Command and Control, their position unequivocally is deterrence will hold. They say it with fortitude, and they repeat that. It was even pinned on the STRATCOM's Twitter feed during COVID. It's not anymore. However, I found a discussion that Lieutenant General Thomas Bussier, the deputy commander of STRATCOM, had with a group of colleagues, where he said, and it's quoted precisely in the book, if deterrence fails, it all unravels. And that unraveling is why we're all here tonight having this discussion. The potential for that unraveling.
I think in following up on that as well, I think it's safe to say that, especially Daniel Ellsberg's book, doomsday machine, that deterrence has never been the United States' only posture. We've always had thought of and planned for first strike capabilities. So I think that's another reason why this book is so important, is to, we have to be a thinking citizenry. We have to really probe and discern and not just take everything we hear as if it was the truth. We have to be very careful, because the narratives that are sometimes brought out there are really not accurate.
I want to add on that. Sorry, Annie.
No, you go first.
But that open-mindedness is crucial for not only us, citizens, but the people in the DoD, Department of Defense, or the nuclear hawks, who or Congress or military officials who handle these nuclear weapons decisions, because another reason why, I'm kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, why and kind of to the question why it's so hard for these people that you interviewed, Annie, to speak up about this, because there's no opposition in their environment whatsoever in general, because they are in an environment where everyone supports deterrence and they stubbornly believe it. And there's no one really questioning, or not as much questioning, the possibilities of it failing. And that's where we come in, because we recognize that no matter how much money we spend into fostering and building deterrence, it is too risky to just rely on something like that. Like you said, Annie Jacobsen, we're one miscalculation, one irrational, one accident away from nuclear war, because it only takes one nuclear weapon to really bring on a chain effect to destroy the world, because there's no such thing as a limited nuclear war. That's just impossible. It's always going to escalate. That's just how deterrence works, retaliation. So sorry to interrupt.
It's really interesting. When you look at deterrence, it really is like a dogma. It's like it's a belief system. There's no evidence that deterrence works. In fact, we know of many times when we've come very close to nuclear war usually because of a computer glitch or some other failure of intelligence, where either Washington or Moscow thought they were under attack and actually began the process of launching their own nuclear arsenals in response. I think you could argue that on those occasions, deterrence failed. Deterrence says that can't happen. No one would ever make the decision to launch the nuclear arsenal. But we've done that. At the last minute, we called back and the Russians called back because they figured out that they were dealing with faulty information. But that wasn't the success of deterrence. That was just good luck, that at the last minute they figured it out. So given that, and given that the people in the government know of all these near misses that we've had, this sort of belief, it's like a form of idolatry, where they just can't acknowledge that this idol deterrence has clay feet, that it does not in fact work, and it's really deeply embedded. People don't want to think about it, and probably because it's such an inconvenient thought to admit that deterrence isn't reliable. If that's true, then oh my God, we might have a nuclear war, just like Annie described in the book.
I'm going to take a question now from Guila. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, who says, I'm just a citizen, so what can I do? I just ordered your book and predict it will scare me sleepless. How do you begin conversations with partners and friends without tuning out? I'm going to jump in here with moderators. Probably say, just a citizen, you are so powerful. We have people back from the brink, a single person I know has organized a hub in her neighborhood, has gotten resolutions passed. We join together, and we just forget how much power we have. Our elected representatives, we elect them to represent us. But the second part of your question, I really do, is really interesting, and I want to just sort of put that to everybody, which is, how do you begin the conversation with partners and friends without their tuning out?
Well, that was the pastoral letter that we wrote in 2022, January 22, actually is on that very premise, that we want to have a conversation. And so we've talked to various people, and that's how we start our conversation. It's a conversation. It's not a debate. We're not here to put you down or to be put down. We're here to have a conversation about something that's critically important to us and to learn. I think that's important. We're not good listeners in our generally. We tend to be more talk more than we listen. So to really listen to the person and to get their point of view and then express our point of view. My firm belief is that if you have an honest, authentic conversation about this issue, it will lead to a verifiable multilateral disarmament. And I think that's our conviction. So I think that it has to be a true conversation and not just waiting for the person to stop talking so I can make my points.
I think the pause after you pose that question, Denise, illustrates this is a tough question. It's probably somewhat easier to give a speech about nuclear war than to turn to a friend and say you want to talk to them about it. But I think really it goes back to something Eddie said before, which is it's everybody's right to know about this. People living on this planet are going to be affected by the decisions that are made, and they have a right to be informed about this so they can give informed consent to the policies that the government takes. And I think if we look at it that way, that we're not bringing them information that we're sort of imposing on them. We're giving them information that they have a right to know. Maybe that makes it a little bit easier to start those conversations. Thanks for that insight, Eddie.
And you can say, I just read this book, is another way that folks could start. But take a question from Amy L. On June 12th, 1982, I participated in a march against nuclear weapons in New York City, along with about 750,000 others. Do you think such a march could be held today? And if so, do you think it would make a difference in public policy? This goes to all.
I mean, I think I'd like to hear what Dr. Helfand has to say about that, because I know you were part of all of that movement and it was powerful. And my answer would be yes, but it would be great to hear from someone who knows from the inside.
In terms of a march with 1 million people in Central Park, I don't think we're there yet. This isn't 1982, but maybe it's 1980. The movement that culminated in that march built very quickly over just a few years. And so I don't think we could pull off a march like that today. I think that's maybe the challenge we set to ourselves. How do we get to a point when 2 years from now we could do something like that, or the 2020s equivalent of that kind of a demonstration? That movement was built very quickly because basically it had the right message, as we do today. The information that's in Annie's book, it's the truth. And that's very powerful. We just have to get it out there. And of course, the book is just an enormously valuable tool in that effort because it is going to reach so many people. We need to use the book. We need to use every other method that we have to get this message out to people. And I think we could build a movement that brings about that kind of pressure on government in a fairly short period of time, 2-3 years.
And I want to note the time and tell folks this was originally planned to be a 75-minute webinar, but we are going to go, a little longer. We're going to go for another 10-15 minutes. If you have to leave, we will send you an email afterwards with a link to this recording and lots of different things you can do. But we're going to continue a little bit because we got more questions than time, but we're going to go through some more. William L. Earlier this week, I was in a conversation attempting to raise funds for nuclear disarmament efforts. The potential donor said, I have a lingering worry that according to experiments, when people are afraid, they become more conservative and nationalistic. So how do we talk to people about the terror of nuclear war without engaging that response and deepening divisions?
I mean, I'll jump in there because I think it's a great, if people are afraid, they are afraid and they perhaps recoil. But I believe that armed with information, people naturally lean forward. And so I also think that the basic information, the simple truth about deterrence, and I'm talking about the 10-second version, the 10-second version of what launch on warning means, the 10-second version of what preemptive first strike means, the 10-second version of, what happens in the first 10 seconds of a satellite system seeing a nuclear launch. Once you know those concepts in very simple terms, as I hoped to put it forth in the book, you get a little bit of power on this subject, and it demystifies it. moves away from being, as Dr. Helfand said, this this kind of idolatry, this golden calf idea of, oh my goodness, it's so confusing, and nuclear weapons are so complex, made by a bunch of people with PhDs. The Defense Department must know better than I. All of that is simply not true when you can reduce these concepts to basic human ideas that, as the Archbishop said, we can just talk about. We don't have to hijack someone at a dinner party and talk their ear off. You can just say, hey, did you know? And try it that way. That's my feeling.
I think too, sometimes when we're afraid, if we have concrete action, something that we can look at, that we can do, that's achievable, that's a beginning, a first step, for example, next August will be the 80th anniversary of dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we're just a little bit over a year away from that very significant anniversary and commemoration. So I think that, we and the Archdiocese of Santa Fe and the Archdiocese of Seattle have joined as sister dioceses with the Diocese of Hiroshima and the Archdiocese of Nagasaki. And we're hoping to expand that to other dioceses in our church to have some kind of concrete action. I think that's an achievable, if we could see some movement toward some demonstrable concrete progress in some way or short, just anything, some kind of a step, a statement from a major political leader saying we need to, like John F. Kennedy's peace speech, in 1963, three, I think. So something of that nature that was remarkable, really, for its innovation and for its boldness and for its creativity. I think if we can have some kind of concrete action like that, and that's a date to look forward to, not look forward to, but I mean a date that we can have as a measure, something we can do, that kind of dispels fear to some degree, I think.
I'm going to move to a question for Ira from John I. Having read the book, audio version, a great one, by the way, there was a clear analysis of the immediate death and destruction of a nuclear exchange. It was almost an afterthought that the resulting nuclear winter, destruction of agricultural fishing, would result in 2 billion people killed, not just in the US, Russia, and North Korea, but the rest of the world. Can you provide further analysis in the future on this devastation?
Yeah, the book deals with the first 72 minutes. The war, the destruction doesn't end there. It is important to recognize that beyond the immediate effects that the war would cause, there is enormous climate disruption, which affects the entire planet, including all the countries that didn't fight the war. The data that was referred to in the question, 2 billion dead, that's the estimated toll from a very limited nuclear war with only 250 100-kiloton bombs being used. And that's the death toll in the first 2 years. The famine would continue beyond that. The study only went out 2 years. The study showed that in a bigger war between the United States and Russia, the death toll would be between 5 and 6 billion people in the first 2 years. That's more than 3/4 of humanity. And these numbers become very, very hard to get your arms around in any way. I mean, they're just literally so beyond our experience. But it's important for us to understand that this is real. This is part of what's going to happen. It's not just the horrible destruction that Annie described so powerfully that takes place right away, but it's the complete destruction of human civilization that ensues from that war. And the fact that, as the passage that Eddie read before suggests, everything's going to be forgotten because there isn't going to be any civilization left to hold on to those memories. Helen Caldecott used to say, it's not just those of us alive today who are at risk. We are going to destroy, if we have a nuclear war, everything we've inherited from our ancestors, everything that we should pass on to our descendants. And that intergenerational aspect of the destruction, I think, also becomes a powerful motivator to people. A lot of us are particularly, especially people in my generation, are particularly concerned, not so much about what happens to us, but what happens to our children and our grandchildren. And we need to understand that we're putting them at risk too. So that data is a very important part of the picture as well.
Thank you. Charles has a question for the Archbishop. I was struck by your account of the impact of visiting Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the celebration of Dorothy Day's feast day in New York City during the UN meeting on nuclear weapons ban treaty. Do you think that there could be merit in making a pilgrimage of people of faith, including youth and elected leaders, to Japan to stimulate the movement to disarm?
Definitely. I think that's a brilliant idea that questioner has. I think that's very powerful. That's the only, thank God, nothing more, but the only time that we've actually seen a nuclear weapon used in actual war, and we know what the devastation that it created. And to this day, the effects are still being felt by the Hibakusha and just in general by everybody, really. So I think that would be very powerful. You know, I think it would show a support for our Japanese brothers and sisters who still live with the reality of that bomb and of the two bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think it would show solidarity. I think it would be very powerful, extremely. But I think I know that the Japanese would welcome such a demonstration and be very, very appreciative of such a demonstration. I think it'd be very powerful.
You. This question I think is anonymous, and I think it can go to all of you, and then I'll provide some closing remarks, and we'll let folks know a bunch of different stuff that you can get going on tonight. This question is, where can you look for people in the middle, the swing voters on nuclear issues?
I'll kick it off here because and again, I'm not an activist as much as I am a journalist. But what I do know to that very important question is that, as I was told, the Congress only pays attention to what the people are paying attention to. And that I believe there really maybe is almost no such thing as a swing voter. It's simply people who don't know or perceive that they don't have the time to know about how insane nuclear war would be, and that knowledge is power. And everyone in this webinar and everyone who is participating has, as the Archbishop said, the power to communicate to another individual. And that is where it all begins.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Annie. Thank you to all of our panelists. This is not at all an easy topic. We know abolition is possible and practicable. Since the height of the Cold War, tens of thousands of nuclear weapons have been dismantled. In 2017, 122 nations voted to adopt the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, no longer willing to leave their fate to nuclear armed states that refuse to comply with their obligation on the Non-Proliferation Treaty to disarm. And as so many people have been saying here, we the people, everyday people, doctors, faith leaders, veterans, scientists, students, teachers, activists, artists, journalists, have more power than we realize. And so I'm going to just say a few words now about Back from the Brink now, and then we'll close up. But Back from the Brink has won support for nuclear abolition from major U.S. cities, counties, states, mayors, local and state elected officials, civic leaders, and experts, including Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, who was featured in Annie's book. We have 15 hubs of local activity, groups of organizations and individuals working together in their communities across the country. And as Ira says, and as we see before us, we are seeing younger faces, students like Eddie and other members of Students for Nuclear Disarmament, who aren't willing to sit on the sidelines when the very possibility of having a future is at stake. And these are uncertain times. We have many, many pressing problems, but we aren't going to have a chance to solve any of them if there's a nuclear war. Nuclear weapons are anti-democratic. They embody so many of the social ills that plague us. Racism and colonialism reflected in nuclear production and uranium mining to tests that resulted in downwinders. People considered low use by the US government, their words. Greed is the false doctrine of deterrence is used to line defense contractors' pockets. And patriarchy is historically the decisions around nuclear weapons were made primarily by men. So dismantling nuclear weapons is part of dismantling these other ills, racism, and of achieving economic justice, environmental justice, and democracy. And like Eddie and so many of you have said before, all people do have a right to know about the danger that nuclear weapons pose to their lives and to have opportunities to engage in meaningful actions to prevent such catastrophic harm. The constituency that we're talking about is meant to answer that question of when we talk to an elected official and they say, yeah, I agree with everything, but I got to hear from my constituents. That's what Back from the Brink is all about. So I'm going to list some ways you can get involved, and Jeremy's going to put up a slide on the screen. Here's some things you can do with Back from the Brink. First, just to simply endorse the campaign and reach out to other kinds of organizations and ask them to endorse as well. You can sign up for our emails where you'll find out about events like this, but also very specific activities you can take. You can call, meet, or urge your House representative to co-sponsor HRES 77. We have 43 co-sponsors, and we know from all of the meetings that we've had that we would have a lot more if we can get more folks calling into their own representative. Organizing a Back from the Brink municipal resolution effort, co-sponsoring a public event. You could host a Back from the Brink presentation for your organization, church, school, civic group. We can provide a speaker, or we can help you do the presentation. Of course, you can host a Buck group discussion of nuclear war, a scenario. We've had this wonderful conversation for the past hour and a half, and it's a good way to talk to your own colleagues and friends. Letters to the editor. Back from the Brink does have local organizer meetups on the third Tuesday of the month. We too have social media that you could follow and amplify. Form or join a Back from the Brink hub. On our website are listed the hubs that we have, and we will also be happy to try to pair people up and help them find organizations in their communities that are taking action. And organizations can become a coalition partner. Of course, I have to say, donate is another very important way to support this work. This is so underfunded. Remember, $100 million spent on producing Oppenheimer was 3 times more than was spent on nuclear disarmament that same year, and very little of that went to grassroots organizing. And the clock is ticking right now on legislation to expand and extend the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, or RECA, which provides compensation to people hurt by nuclear weapons testing and uranium mining. It's due to expire in just a little over a week on June 7th. So the Senate passed legislation, but it's urgent the House do the same. And we urge everybody to contact House Speaker Mike Johnson and urge him to support the legislation and bring it to a vote. And last but not least, vote and get involved and get out the vote efforts this fall. We will have no way of even trying to prevent nuclear war if we lose our democracy. So we want to thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you so much, Annie Jacobsen, for your book and for this wonderful conversation. Archbishop Wester, Eddie Laiche, Dr. Helfand. Please stay in touch. Our information is on the website and on the screen below. Thank you again, and good night.